Benghazi, man. A city that's been through it all. And it's so often just reduced to a soundbite.
Yeah.
But today, we're going to do a deep dive into what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Using this article from Investor, The Battle for Benghazi, Libya's Struggle Against ISIS and Extremist Forces.
It's a fascinating case study. I mean, Benghazi's story really reveals so much about just how complex this fight against ISIS is in Libya and the immense challenges of, rebuilding a nation after a revolution like that.
Right. Okay, so let's set the scene. Gaddafi falls in 2011.
Hmm.
Libya essentially goes into a tailspin.
Yeah.
But why did Benghazi, of all places, become such a flashpoint?
Well, for starters, it's the second largest city. So, there's that strategic importance right off the bat. But Benghazi has this really unique mix of geographic factors that made it just like a prime target for a group like ISIS.
Okay.
You've got vast deserts, perfect for, covert operations, a long coastline, ideal for smuggling. And it's practically a neighbor to some other really unstable regions.
Ah, I see. So ISIS kind of saw an opportunity to exploit all that chaos.
Exactly, yeah. And they weren't just, grabbing whatever scraps of land they could. This article really highlights just how calculated they were, taking control of key areas in Benghazi, including the port.
Controlling the port. What's the big deal with that?
Think of it this way. Whoever controls the port, they control the flow of everything.
Right. Yeah.
Goods, weapons, even people. It goes way beyond just territory. It's about economic and logistical dominance. ISIS, they were playing the long game, using Benghazi to try and, plant their flag in Libya and potentially even destabilize the entire region.
Wow. So you've got this city basically in the clutches of ISIS. And then you've got all these Libyan forces trying to push back. The article mentions the Libyan National Army, LNA, and then some local militias, like the Benghazi Anti-Terrorism Unit. Can you give us a sense as who these guys are and what they were up against?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. You've got the LNA, which is, more of a traditional military force led by General Khalifa Haftar. But then you have all these local militias, often formed along tribal or regional lines, each with their own, goals and loyalties.
Okay.
And that makes it challenging to,
Work together.
yeah, to present a united front.
Yeah, I bet. And the article actually mentioned a commander, Faraj Quaim. Was he, typical of the kind of people leading this fight?
Yeah, he really embodies, I think, that courage and determination of just so many everyday Libyans who they stepped up to defend their country. They weren't just soldiers, following orders. These were individuals risking their lives to protect their communities from a very real threat.
Yeah, sounds incredibly dangerous. But the article also mentions this major obstacle that these groups face, the UN arms embargo.
Right.
How did that affect the fight against ISIS?
Just imagine trying to fight a group like ISIS. We know how brutal they are. We know their access to weapons. And you're restricted in your own ability to arm yourself.
Right.
I mean, that was the reality for the Libyan forces because of that UN arms embargo.
Ah.
I mean, the intention, of course, was to prevent further violence. But a lot of critics argue that it actually just made things worse. It really hindered those fighting against ISIS from, actually being able to defend themselves.
So they're basically fighting with one hand tied behind their backs.
Yeah, exactly. And then to make things even more complicated, Libya wasn't exactly united.
Right.
Internally.
Yeah, you're talking about those internal divisions within Libya.
Yes.
The article mentioned, rival governments, and there's all these conflicting agendas.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically like fighting amongst themselves at the same time they're battling ISIS.
Precisely. Libya was, and in many ways still is, deeply fragmented politically. There were, different governments all vying for legitimacy, conflicting agendas among all the militias, just a general lack of trust.
Okay.
And it made it almost impossible to mount any kind of coordinated response, an effective response against ISIS.
Yeah, that's a major issue.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you fight an external threat if you can't even agree on who's in charge or what you're trying to achieve?
Right.
Or
Exactly. It's a huge challenge. And unfortunately, it had some devastating consequences. The article mentions the tensions between General Haftar, he's the LNA leader,
Right.
and then some of these militias who just did not trust him. They were very wary of his ambitions. And all that mistrust sometimes led to, miscommunication and tragically even friendly fire incidents from airstrikes.
Wow, friendly fire.
Yeah.
That's a heartbreaking reminder of just the cost of those internal divisions.
It really highlights the complexity of this conflict. It's
Yeah.
not just a clear-cut good versus evil battle. It's this web of competing
Yeah.
interests, internal struggles, external pressures, all just like converging on this one city.
Man, sounds incredibly chaotic. And I imagine incredibly dangerous for, the average person just trying to live in Benghazi. The article paints a pretty grim picture of what life was actually like for the people living in Benghazi during this whole battle. Over 100,000 residents displaced from their homes, schools forced to close. I mean, the constant threat of violence. What kind of toll does that take on a community, long term?
I mean, try to imagine it. Just living with that daily fear of bombings, never knowing if you can go home, if your kids will be safe going to school. That was reality for a lot of people in Benghazi. And, those psychological scars, those run deep.
Yeah, it's so easy to just focus on, the military side or the politics of it all. But we can't forget about the human cost. The article actually mentions parents still sending their kids to school, even with all that chaos. Why would they do that?
I think it's that human spirit, you know? It's resilience. Even in the face of like unimaginable hardship, people, they try to cling to any sense of normalcy, to routine, and sending their kids to school, even if it was dangerous, it offered like a glimmer of hope, a feeling that life could go on.
It's powerful. And what about the fighters themselves? I mean, they're facing this brutal enemy, often with limited resources, support. What impact did that have on them?
Yeah, the article talks about that trauma experienced by those on the front lines. A lot of these fighters, they were just ordinary people who picked up arms to defend their homes, their families, and they didn't have the training, the equipment, the psychological support that, professional soldiers would get.
So they were dealing with, the horrors of war,
Yeah.
basically on their own.
Yeah, pretty much. And the long-term effects of that, they're huge. We're talking PTSD, depression, anxiety, and a lot of other issues that can just make it really hard to live a normal life afterwards.
It's a reminder that the wounds of war go way beyond just, the physical ones.
Absolutely. And they can last for years, even decades.
So all this sounds pretty bleak. Did the international community do anything to help?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. The article mentions the U.S. and NATO really grappling with, should we intervene? How do we intervene in Libya? They were involved back in 2011, right? That led to Gaddafi's fall. But Benghazi was different.
So they were hesitant to get involved again.
There are a lot of factors. Some people argued that another intervention would just pour gasoline on the fire, potentially drag foreign powers into another forever war. Others, they felt this moral obligation to help. I mean, there's a country struggling against this brutal extremist group.
Sounds like a lose-lose situation. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, pretty much. And in the end, the international community's response, it was kind of all over the place. There were airstrikes, against ISIS targets, but no big military intervention. There was humanitarian aid, too, and some diplomatic efforts to try and, broker some kind of political solution.
But did any of it actually work? I mean, where does Benghazi stand now?
Well, the article, it's cautiously optimistic, I guess you could say. On the one hand, ISIS was pushed out of Benghazi, which is huge. That's a big win. But, their ideology, their networks, all that stuff, it's still out there.
So, a victory, but maybe not a lasting one, huh?
Yeah. And fighting ISIS, that's just, one battle in this whole war.
Right.
Right.
The article kept bringing up the need for political reconciliation, a more unified Libya, if they want any chance at peace.
Right. I mean, you can't just defeat the bad guys and think everything's going to magically go back to the way it was.
Right.
You've got to deal with the stuff that allowed groups like ISIS to take root in the first place. We're talking corruption, economic development, a more inclusive political system.
Man, that's a tall order. Especially with, all the divisions that still exist within Libya.
It's going to be a long road, for sure. But, it's the only way if they want peace, stability. And the article really stressed that this has got to be a coordinated effort, not just, within Libya, but the international community's got to step up too.
Yeah. Okay, so for our listeners, why should we care? Benghazi's, what, thousands of miles away?
True. But it's a stark reminder that we're all connected. What happens in one part of the world, it can have a ripple effect. The problems in Libya, they can contribute to the refugee crisis, to terrorism, even affect global energy markets. It's all connected.
And it really makes you think about, the role of intervention, how complicated peace building actually is. There's no easy answers.
Exactly. And so often, we just want to simplify things, right? Good guys, bad guys. But Benghazi shows just how nuanced these situations can be.
It's like a call to action almost, to stay informed, to talk about these things, and, to push for solutions that actually get to the root of the problem.
Exactly. The battle for Benghazi, yeah, that might be over. But the fight for a peaceful Libya, that's still going on. And it's a story we should all be paying attention to.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. Benghazi's story is way more than just a headline. It's a microcosm of so much of what's happening in the world today. Extremism, political turmoil, the human cost of war, and the fact that recovery, that takes time.
It does. And while the future for Benghazi, for Libya, it's still uncertain, I think one thing is clear. Understanding their story, it helps us understand the world better, the challenges we all face,
Absolutely. Well, thanks for going on this deep dive with us. We hope it's got you thinking, and that you'll keep learning, stay engaged, and never underestimate just how powerful it is to understand what's really going on in the world.